Thank you, Mr. Provost, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrés Mejia Acosta. I'm the Associate Dean for Policy and Practice at the Keough School of Global Affairs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and the panelists to this conversation. My job is to be the moderator of the first panel of the session, Democracy and Development in Mexico at the Breaking Point. I want to thank, as my predecessors did, Jaime, Aníbal, Héctor, for convening this event together, and all the colleagues at the Kellogg Institute and Universidad Panamericana. We made an effort to have a more inclusive and diverse panel, and made an effort to invite other panelists like Claudia Ruiz-Massieu, Valeria Moy, Lila Abed from the Wilson Center, but unfortunately they could not join us in this occasion. I also want to thank and welcome the presence of the online audience as well as the in-person audience before this panel. What will happen over the next hour or so is we have the participation of two brilliant economists, both from ETAM. So with myself, we make a trio of ETAM students in this panel. And I will first ask Alejandro to speak for about 10 minutes. José Antonio will speak for another 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. So I will start introducing Alejandro Estefan first. Alejandro is an assistant professor of development economics at the Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. His work focuses on economic development to inform decision-making, and he's produced specific research and published research on factors lifting individuals out of poverty, the effects of public investment in schooling, female labor force participation and its impact on gender violence, and state capacity and tax revenue collection. He has been a research scholar at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, the Center for Economic and Human Development at the University of Chicago, and his previous professional experience includes working as a policy analyst at the Presidency of the Republic of Mexico. He was awarded the Asian Development Bank Best Paper Prize in Economics and the Banamex Prize in Economics as well. He completed his PhD at the University College London in 2019, where the Economic and Social Research Council of the United Kingdom supported his doctoral research. Welcome, Alejandro Estefan.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Andres, for your kind introduction. It's truly an honor to share stage with such a illustrious group of people. I had some slides prepared for today, but I've been told that generally it works better without slides, so I'll try to convey my message without any aid. I guess the first thing to mention here is, rather than giving you a lecture on law and political science, of which I know very little, I want to begin our discussion by talking about the economic challenges of Mexico, right? So, and I'll try to concentrate my discussion around the first one, but I'll briefly mention the other two challenges that I see based on my studies on this subject. The first challenge that I see for the Mexican economy is clearly that of strengthening state capacity. What do I mean by state capacity? I mean the ability of the government to provide public goods and uphold the law. And here, I guess the key question, not only research, but policy question is, can the government leverage the tools at its disposal to accomplish this goal? In other words, it is really not obvious whether the government can use what it has at hand to accomplish its development goals. And what I'll try to argue is that based on my research and the work I've previously done, that evidence suggests that across a broad set of fronts, the government indeed can improve state capacity. And so I'll focus my discussion around two ways through which the government can do so. The first one is the use of administration tools, and in particular, the use of tax administration tools. A few years ago, I was approached by the government of Mexico City to study whether tax rate hikes, meaning increases in the tax rate, as well as improvements in enforcement policy could lead to higher tax revenues. And so what we did is we partnered up with them and gained access to the taxpayer records for the entire city, in particular the property tax records. And we examined, using quasi-experimental strategies, whether increases in the tax rate led to increases in tax revenue or not. And what we found was actually very interesting. What we found is that as the government increased the tax rate, tax revenues did go up. However, compliance went down. So the taxpayers that continued paying their taxes paid more. Yet when the tax rate increases, less taxpayers comply. And so that was an informative finding for the government. We also examined how increased enforcement affected tax revenues. And what we find in that particular case is that as enforcement efforts improve, revenues go up and compliance goes up, meaning more taxpayers pay. However, this policy of increasing enforcement exacerbates liquidity constraints that taxpayers face. And so in particular, poor taxpayers face difficulty in complying with their taxes. A second example of a policy that can increase or improve state capacity is regulation and reform. Again, a few years back, I was approached by the federal government to work on a study examining the effects of a prohibition on subcontracting practices that were deemed as abusing or abusive against workers. And so what we did with them was we gathered information from the National Institute of Statistics, or INEGI, as well as the National Ministry of Social Security, or IMSS, and using their firm level and worker level data, we examined what the effect of the reform was on worker wages and employment status. Prior to the reform, the conception was that by prohibiting outsourcing, employment rates would go down and there would be no improvement in wages. And what we found was the opposite, namely wages went up, there was no effect on employment. Now, this is not to glorify the efforts of the administration that implemented this reform, but it is to mention that in both instances, what we've learned is the government can indeed improve state capacity through the tools it has at its disposal, in particular, first through administration, and second through regulation and reform. And that takes me to the point I want to make today. The question here for these audiences, and the one with which I would like to challenge Jose Antonio, is how can administrative tools and regulation or regulatory reform be used in two ways or for two purposes? The first of them is, how can we strengthen Mexico's judiciary system and the administration of justice, which are clearly important for the country? And second, how can these tools be used to prevent capture and protect constitutional order as well, right? Or protect the judiciary system against the efforts of the executive in particular to try to capture it. So the challenge here is how can we use the tools that we have at hand, in particular to improve the administration of justice in Mexico, as well as to protect the current constitutional order. What are the sets of policies that should be designed in that regard, as well as the set of reforms that can be put in place? I mentioned at the beginning that there are two other challenges that I see for the Mexican economy. I want to talk about them briefly without going in depth. The first of them is clear to me and has to do it has a close relation to the subject of democracy, and that is the challenge of reducing poverty and inequality. It is fairly clear that without poverty reduction and inequality reduction, effective democracy will not be possible in Mexico, right? And so the question again here is, what sorts of policies can be implemented to successfully tackle poverty and to reduce poverty? And here the question again is, what should the government focus on? Should we focus on education, healthcare, perhaps on place-based policies? Again, that's a question for José Antonio. And then the third challenge is that of fostering private sector development. In particular, what are the factors that may underpin private sector growth, such as capacity building, the rule of law, industrial policy, innovation and quality upgrading, as well as increased competition in capital or access to capital. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro, for keeping in time. It's my ungrateful role to be the timekeeper. It is my pleasure next to introduce you to a man who probably needs no introduction, certainly to a Mexican audience, José Antonio Meade Curibreña. He has an extensive experience in public administration, banking, and financial policy. As a government official, he has held cabinet-level positions in the federal government of Mexico, including as Secretary of Finance and Public Credit, Secretary of Social Development, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Secretary of Energy, and prior to his appointment to the cabinet, he served as Undersecretary and as Chief of Staff in the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit. Following his time as Director General of Banking and Savings at the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit, Dr. Meade served as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Bank for Rural Credit, and it was part of the creation of a new institution, Financiera Rural. Dr. Meade is also has an active presence in the private sector, and he is a member of the advisory board of the Global Center of Adaptation. He serves as a non-executive director of both Alfa and Grupo Comercial, Grupo Chedraui groups, and he's also a part of the consultative board of UNICEF in Mexico. He has studied economics and law at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México and Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México before receiving a PhD in economics from Yale University. Thank you, José Antonio. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I last came to Notre Dame 20 years ago, actually to talk about the transformation of Ban Rural into Financiera Rural. I probably didn't do that good a job because it took 20 years for you to invite me back. So I'll try
fix that.
I'll try to do it better now so I get invited back, maybe in 5 or 6 years or so. This time, Jaime was very smart, so he actually used my son, who's a big admirer of his, to get me to come here. So Jaime called my son, and my son said, well, you're going to get a call, and you're going to say yes, which I did. And I'm very happy that I did. So just in terms of inclusiveness, I also studied law, even though I'm not a very good lawyer, with Alfredo. So UNAM is partly represented in this panel as well, and Alfredo would do better credit to UNAM and to the legal profession. So I'll try to talk a little bit about politics, a little bit about social policy, and a little bit about elections in general and social development, because I think there's many interesting things happening in that arena that makes Alejandro's questions even more complicated, because it's not just a matter of choosing which policy tools you deploy. It's also a matter of understanding whether those policy tools will be supported by democracy or not, in the following sense. So I came here via Lima. which was not the most direct route to take to Notre Dame. So when Mexico City, Lima, and then Atlanta, South Bend. So it took about, I don't know, 10, 12 hours to get here. But I went to Lima because I was invited to reflect upon 10 years after a meeting we had around the Pacific Alliance in Lima. So had you invited me here 10 years ago, what would we be discussing? We would probably be talking about the Pacific Alliance, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, building a developmental model around basic core elements on freedom of goods, services, and capital. The Pacific Alliance was engaging with Mercosur, so that created a sense of excitement in the region. That integration was possible for the very first time around a mechanism that centered on those values. Mercosur was actually talking to the European Union and modernizing the trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union seemed a likely possibility. It's been 10 years and that hasn't materialized, but at the time there was a lot of excitement that it could. Cuba and the US were getting together. CELAC was holding its plenary session in Cuba with all of the heads of states represented at that meeting, with the exception of Panama. And the then president of Panama sacked his foreign minister because he gave him the bad advice that it wasn't a meeting worth attending. We had the Summit of the Americas. Every single head of state was there. And that is where the reapproachment between President Obama and President Castro actually took place. We kind of thought we had it made, that liberal democracy was performing, that it was providing good results, that it was actually not just providing good results domestically, but that it was providing an integration mechanism for a region that had suffered from lack of integration for a very, very long time. If you look at the numbers, the numbers look to be doing well. Extreme poverty in the region had gone down dramatically. The intensity of poverty in Latin America was drastically reduced. And in general, you were seeing good levels of growth and an expanded set of opportunities. So one could be sort of forgiven for thinking that we were doing a good job. And if we talked amongst ourselves, amongst policymakers, there was a wide agreement that we were. We were happy about the results that we were achieving, and we thought they were going to be validated by people come elections. And the only caveat, the only problem with that vision is that people didn't agree. People were not happy. People were not happy, and it manifested itself in many ways throughout the region. In many cases, and we were fortunate, Mexico was amongst those where the manifestation of that unhappiness was through elections. They basically voted us out, and that's a very eloquent way of showing your level of discontent. But you also started seeing riots in places like Chile, Ecuador, Colombia. So there was a lot of social unrest that reflected the fact that people were not happy with the direction that things were going. So you had this sort of paradox where you thought you were deploying the policy tools in the right way. You thought that the results were there, but people were not happy either with the results or with our democracies. They thought that democracies were not delivering the results that they were expecting. And in comes a wave of political outsiders, Central, Latin America in general, moved to the extremes. They didn't move to the left or to the right. Basically, they hollowed out the center, and you had the extremes competing in almost every one of the countries in very divisive elections, in a very polarized environment. So integration was now out of the question. Democracy was being questioned, and the policies that has gotten us to where we were 10 years back were being questioned as well. And I think it is within that framework that we should see at what's happening between the interaction of politics and policy. And I think that out of that reflection, positive things might actually happen in terms of being understood. Talking about social development in particular, because I think that provides some good examples. If you go back to Mexico under President Salinas, so the way that social development policy was constructed was through the building of social capital within the region and the towns and the collectivity. So basically the model was, let's get people organized, let's help them identify what they think they need in order to become more successful. And then let's jointly, the public sector and the community builds toward achieving those ends. And everybody that's roughly my age remembers the Solidaridad program and the Solidaridad sort of way of communicating. The people would get together and they would decide, well, here we need a sidewalk, here we need a clinic, here we need better lighting, here we need more security. But it was basically an exercise of building social capital, getting the collectivity to agree, and providing the goods, the specific public services that they thought they needed. In comes President Cedillo, and there was a big paradigm shift. And basically, social policy went from let's ask the collectivity what they think they need, to we know what the community needs, and we're going to provide it to them through conditional cash transfers programs. So the idea was that in order to break multi-generational poverty, you needed to provide education, you needed to provide health, and you needed to provide access to sustainable food and nutrition. And you basically provided cash resources, typically to the mothers, in exchange for them providing food, education, and health services to their children. And that was the way to break the multi-cyclical poverty in Mexico. And you got some good results. So from the 90s up until 2018, extreme poverty specifically dropped dramatically. Poverty not as much, but it was trending in the right direction. But again, people were not happy with that policy either. In comes the Andrés Manuel administration. And with him comes, again, a new paradigm shift in the way that the government was intervening in social development. And it's almost paradoxical the way that the intervention worked, because you went from a president that probably reflects neoliberalism and the liberal vision with Salinas, who was providing social development type policies through collectivity and dialogue and the building of social capital. Then you went to President Cedillo, who was providing conditional cash transfers. And now you had Andrés Manuel coming theoretically from the left, and he was just basically providing cash. Now, going back into democracy, if you ask people which of those three policies they would rather have, incurring the cost of building social capital and reaching agreement of what you needed, receiving cash conditional on you performing certain tasks, or just receiving cash, but turns out just receiving cash is much more popular than the other two alternatives. Is that what's best for people, and is that what's best for the country? I think that's an open question, because to Estefan's question, it's not obvious whether you can design policy from your desk without asking what people want. And when you measure the level of satisfaction that people are receiving from unconditional cash transfers, and you compare it with where they were with conditional cash transfers, the quantum of change is quite dramatic. So I think that I think at least from my perspective, and going back to elections, I think it's obvious that you can't go back to the previous paradigm. I mean, if you look at the results, Mexico in general has had a lackluster performance in terms of the economy. The economy is going to grow this administration around 0.7% of GDP. That's low even by Mexican standards. The average from 20 to 2018 was around 2.5, a bit less 2.2, last administration 2.5. The level of job creation is going to be about half, both the number and the rate that we did under the previous administration. If you compare Mexico vis-a-vis the world, Mexico both smaller vis-a-vis the world. So in general, you would think that performance would result in a relatively large level of discontent, and it hasn't. People are happy with the administration, the president works well, and people are satisfied. That, I think, gives you an idea as to the magnitude of the change in terms of the satisfaction vis-a-vis the design of the policy intervention. And it's striking on many levels, and even after just 5 years, if you look at the numbers, because many things strike out. You're providing support for the youth because they're young, which philosophically sounds quite interesting. You're not conditioning that support of them going to school. So what has happened? Less people between the age of 3 and 21 are going to school. You actually lost about 1.8 million students from that age bracket for the first time in our history. Yet, if you ask the young whether they're happy with this administration, they will say that they are, which either shows that their discount rate is very high, that they value their liberty by a lot, that they're probably not able to see the consequences of their actions going forward. But regardless, convincing them to going back to receiving conditional support is not going to be successful from an electoral perspective. And the same, you would likely find in many cases similar outcomes where people are happy, yet you could argue that long run, that's probably not the best thing for the country. In some cases, I think that the policy was the correct one, and the country will be the better for it. Old age, non-contributory pension. I think it's a good idea. And I think that if you look at poverty in the old age, that's going to be reduced dramatically, and people are happy, and rightly so. Doing away with outsourcing. I think that was a very good policy. And I think that doing away with outsourcing with capping the participation of profits by workers was sound from a fiscal perspective, and it was the right shift in terms of policies. So I think that was a good policy with good results for the country long run. But there are a big set, I think, of interesting paradoxes where what's popular from an electoral perspective is not necessarily going to be successful in driving long-term growth and development. So I think that staying the way that we are is probably also not the best alternative. And that means that we're likely going to have to find a middle ground, something that generates the correct incentives in terms of the development of the country going forward, while at the same time, it retains popular support and it's able to gather and to actually win elections. And I'll just give one final example, and then we could probably exchange views amongst ourselves and get you to ask some questions. But the way that we measure income in Mexico is quite interesting, because we basically ask people how much they make, which is not the most sophisticated way of measuring income. And you get two sort of biases when you measure income in that way. In all of the history of DME, which is the mechanism, the survey through which we ask people every 2 years how much they make, and which the tool through which we measure poverty with, never in the history of DME has somebody said that they make more than 2 million pesos a year. Now, Alfredo tells me he used to collect taxes, that he has direct evidence that some people in Mexico actually did make more than $100,000 a year. Yet that was not reflected in the polls. Asking somebody that makes more than 2 million pesos a year how much they make on a monthly basis is complicated, because first you have to get them to open the door. Then you have to get them to receive the surveyor for 5 straight evenings and answer those questions. But secondly, it's a sophisticated question because you don't know how much you make on a monthly basis. Depends on what happens with the stock markets, it depends what happens with the interest rate, and you probably get resources from different sources. So the question is complicated. But the question is even more complicated at the other end of the spectrum. If you ask somebody that's in the lower deciles of income how much they're making on a monthly basis, the question probably doesn't make any sense, because in some cases they're working in construction, some cases they're working in the fields, in some cases they're not working at all, in some cases a big chunk of their income is not received in cash, rather it's received in kind, and it's difficult to put a price in terms of what that's worth. In some cases, you actually live in an exchange economy, so you manufacture crafts and you exchange them for goods in the market. So it's a very abstract question exactly how much it is that you make. But my point is, the level of income that is captured from the last TENIG is way bigger than the level of income that was captured by the previous NX. And my hypothesis is that that gives you a sense of how much more value is placed on the unconditional cash transfer versus the conditional cash transfer. When I was Minister of Social Development, we provided some sort of like if it was a bank account, and we went to the people that were receiving support in kind, and we would tell them, this is what you're entitled to receive. Now, we wanted that mechanism for a couple of reasons. We wanted to make sure that they did receive what they were entitled to receive. So that if they got less for whatever reason, but they had a document that they could provide to the government and say, well, he's taking money away from my rights. But we also wanted them to reflect in a better way the support that they were receiving. And the results, when you compare the two, are striking. So we provided roughly $170 support for people to take and pay for childcare for their kids. And then we would ask, well, how much money did you receive? $50. Well, no, I gave you $175. No, you gave me 50. No, here's the check. I gave you $175. Well, if you had given me $175, I would have just 50 to give those resources to my mom to take care of my kids, and I would have used the balance to do other things. So you're spending $175. You're giving me something that you say is worth $175, but that's only worth 50 to me. Whereas now that it's unconditional, even if I'm giving them less money, they're happier for it, and they value it even more. And I'll just give one final example in terms of that policy debate that I think will put it in starker contrast. We faced an earthquake in Mexico in 2017. Houses were destroyed in Oaxaca and Chiapas. A house in Oaxaca and Chiapas could basically be reconstructed by spending about $9,000, 180,000 pesos. I thought that the responsibility of the state was to make people whole after the earthquake. So we basically provided cash conditional on them spending that cash in materials or in contracting people to rebuild their houses. A couple of years went by, the houses were built. We had done our job in terms of making them whole again, but people were not happy. They really didn't feel that we had provided any support. We reconstructed their house, but through those 2 years, they felt that the government was absent. We had a hurricane in Acapulco. Houses were destroyed. A house in Acapulco is much more expensive than they were in Oaxaca and in Chiapas. The house in Acapulco is probably worth reconstructing a house in the margins of Acapulco, $20,000 to $25,000. The government provided around $3,500 to $4,100. So they provided only a fraction of the value of the house. So you went and talked with people. How are you? Terrible. No? So what happened? My house was destroyed. How much time did it take you to build that house? 20 years. How much is it going to take you to reconstruct the house? 20 years. This is really terrible. The hurricane was really, really bad. Well, how has the government been? Fantastic. How do you mean fantastic? Oh, they gave me $4,000 and I can do with that money whatever I want. No, they had never seen $4,000 in their life or had the freedom to spending as they wanted. So they're not going to rebuild the house. It's going to take them 10 years. The loss in terms of their endowment was huge, but they were very happy with the level of support because they had the freedom to spend it as they wanted to. So in closing, I think that the debate between development, policy intervention, and democracy is a very complicated one. And I think for those of us studying policy, because we're not designing it anymore by popular acclaim, we're just now analysts in terms of policy, so it becomes a very sophisticated question, because the policy that you design doesn't just need to get the results right, it also needs to get popular support. And I think that the lessons drawn from this journey of the last 10 years is that in many ways, those of us that were designing policy, those of us that were charged with implementing it, those of us that were studying those policy interventions were probably not taking into consideration how those policies were actually valued by the people on the receiving end. So the perception that there was a disconnect between the elites and Joe the plumber, between the ITAM, the academia, the Keough School of Global Affairs, and people in the mainstream, but there was a disconnect that was reflected in the elections. So I think that going forward, we need to do better in the sense that if we only get political support for bad policies, but we are going to end up in a bad place. But if we think that good policies are going to sell themselves, but we're only going to get to see them in academic papers because we're never going to get to implement them. So I think that the lessons for the last 10 years is it's not enough to get the policy intervention right. You also need to get the politics behind the public intervention right, and that's not an easy thing to do. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Jose Antonio, for those very clear and sobering comments, and reinforces precisely the need to establish a bridge between the research and the policy implications of it. I want to abuse briefly my position as a moderator here to offer a short question and a more broad question to the panelists. The short question or comment is that back in 2006, Mexican intellectual and politician Jorge Castañeda had written a very influential article in Foreign Affairs talking about the two lefts. There was the right left meaning a social democrat brand of left that was more moderate, that was more observant of democratic institutions, that was more inclusive, that was somewhat market friendly. And he was very much thinking of Brazil and Mexico at the time. And he also pointed to the bad left, the wrong left, that was had more authoritarian tendencies, was more illiberal, was definitely less observant of democratic practices. And he was very much thinking of Venezuela's Chavez or Cuba. A long time has come since, and I wanted to get your impression on, of course, whether this dichotomy is still relevant, and how would you characterize the government of AMLO in this spectrum, particularly because when he was elected to office, and I was in Mexico in 2018, there was a lot of expectation of this left-wing candidate that, depending on how you count the numbers, it could be up to 7 decades that Mexico had not had a left-wing option. So how would you characterize this, his brand of left-wing politics?
So I don't think it fits nicely into either one of those two models. So it will be, I think, very surprising to you, but when I was first asked to be a candidate, people thought I didn't connect, which is very weird because I'm so charismatic that I don't know how people would think that I was not connecting. But I think that establishing a connection has two levels to it. One of them is mechanical, how you speak, the rhythm, whether you're able to read, the crowd, and that takes some work. And if you're, the Minister of Finance, and then you're asked to go from there to speaking to 5,000 people, and you have to say, well, the people from Sinaloa, you're so gorgeous, and I would look at the floor and blush, and people, whatever, she doesn't really think that we're gorgeous, 3 months into the campaign, you went to Chiapas, and well, you guys are just beautiful. And people would say, well, he doesn't like the Sinaloans, but he really thinks that the Chiapas are. But the other level of connection, I think, is topical. You have to talk about what people care. And I think that Andrés Manuel campaigned for 18 years. And I think that he therefore had a lot of time to practice both those levels of connection. I think that he connected very well in terms of the rhythm, the way that he spoke, the language that he used. And it almost felt as if you were going to, I don't know, a Billy Joel concert. You could sing the lyrics and you could complete the words and you had a pretty good time because you felt right at home in any one of those events because you had a good sense as to the rhythm, the flow. So the connection was there at this sort of physical level. But I think that what makes Andrés interesting is after 18 years, he had a very good handle as to what the topical concerns were, as to what Mexicans thought was important, as to what Mexicans thought needed to be corrected. And I think that out of those 18 years came a set of principles that were very disjointed. So Andrés had the impression that Mexicans, for many reasons, we've come from a long period of cyclical crisis, and people were weary of crisis. So they said he came away thinking, fiscal stability is important. To what level? Mexico was probably the only country in the world that ran a primary surplus during the pandemic. So that's how deeply he felt about fiscal responsibility, to the point where he probably did not expand. We were probably one of the governments that expanded the fewest fiscal effort in terms of providing support to families and to firms during the pandemic. He believed that the central bank needed to be autonomous. To what level? Mexico's interest rate is 11%. That's similar to the level of interest rate in nominal terms that Russia pays, and they're in war. There's a book by Werner that looks at the interest rate that Argentina was paying to Venezuela, which he thought should be depicted in the Merchant of Venice because it was so high. It was 14%. So the level of interest that Mexico is paying takes the level of autonomy of the central bank to an almost new level. He came away with the perception that unconditional was better than conditional. So there were a basic set of ideas that he took out of those 18 years that don't fit neatly into that mode. But it brings me to another reflection because you started with Chavez. But I think that another trend that makes politics hard and I think interesting is leaders tend to talk to people differently now that they did some time back. If you go back to when we were kids, the president never spoke to the people. They spoke to other powers, and we would get together and we would get the day off to listen to the State of the Union. And that is where we had an impression as to where the president's mind was at. And he provided messages and it was important. Then president started to speak with people through very well curated interviews. And we all kind of remember how those interviews worked, and they did a couple of those a year, and they were published in the case of Mexico in El Sol de México and Vázquez Raña, But Chavez, I think, changed that in the sense that with the Aló Presidente, he started talking directly with the people. And then I think, and it's interesting, the progression, you went from Chavez to Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, to Trump, to Twitter, to El Presidente with La Mañanera. Now, I've been minister 5 times, and I'm lucky that they invite me to the UP to teach once in a while. So waking up to get to the 7 o'clock class is hard, and I actually still have to prepare it. And I had to prepare for these remarks and what have you. He does this every single day for 3 hours. That takes communicating with the people to a different level. So I think that in the case of Mexico's president, which I don't think is the case for Latin America. So I think that probably Boric and Petro versus Noboa and others fit more neatly into the taxonomy that Castañeda has. But I think that the president is on a mode of his own because I don't think he has an ideology. I think he has a collection of ideas that came about by working and campaigning. And one final point to that means that when he picks a fight, we should listen because he may not get the policy right, but the politics behind the fight probably do address So I think that's a real source of concern.
Thank you. And I want to pick up on that point and the warning note, which you ended earlier, about this, for lack of a better term, kind of a plebiscitarian policy making, this very down to earth, very fine-tuned attention to what people are needed. And as you said, the policies may not be right or correctly aligned, but there's certainly a reflection of what the people seem to need. So my question is there a trade-off between having this kind of a attuned policy making and the trade-off with the respect for democratic institutions, the bourgeois democratic institutions, as some leaders would have said back in Latin America, the checks and balances, judiciary independence, autonomy of the electoral authority, etc. And the trade-off in the sense that it is through democratic institutions that you build the rule of law that Alejandro was asking about. So is there a trade-off between this more people-oriented policy making versus the building of a more structured institutional republic?
I think there is. And I think that's at a core what's at stake in the Mexican election. So simplifying, you had two presidents that were almost the exact opposite of each other in terms of trying to characterize what's at stake in the election. And both of them came from a similar place. So President Peña thought that half the country was doing well, half the country was not doing well. Andrés believed the same. So Peña came at the problem and said, well, what do we need to do for the other half to do well? So we need either more money or we need to induce the private sector to invest more in oil, in energy, in telecommunications, in education. So if you look at the structural reforms, in each case, what they were doing was they were providing a legal arrangement that induced the private sector to invest. So how do you convince someone in Mexico to invest in deep water when you have an incumbent that's a public state monopoly? But that's a hard proposition to make, because assuming that you go into the country and you find oil in the middle of the Gulf. So how do you then get that oil into the market? Well, you need to have boats, you need to have docks and pipelines, and you need to have storage. And who has that in Mexico? Only Pemex does. So you needed to recognize that there was an asymmetry between the private sector and the public monopoly that had to be corrected by an asymmetric regulation. So you put that asymmetric regulation in play, and you give the private sector assurances that the public monopoly is going to provide access to their critical infrastructure. And you go sector by sector and do the same. And I'll give an example that may be counterintuitive. So I could not teach in a public school in Mexico, because if I wanted to be a teacher in a public school in Mexico, so studying at ITAM, not good enough. Studying at UNAM, not good enough. Surprisingly, teaching at UP, not good enough either. I would have to come out of una normal, which is a public sector entity that actually educates the teachers. Now, they have a monopoly on being able to teach in the public sector. Now, one way to increase the quality of our teachers is to do away with that monopoly. And that would allow Alejandro and Andrés and Alfredo and Cisca to go and teach in a public school in Mexico. But that would have weakened the control of the unions. So that public reform was put in place, and that public reform was rolled back by Andrés. But in a sense, even education reform had a fiscal component to it. If you wanted to induce the private sector to invest in providing teachers for the public schools in Mexico, but you had to change this environment. Now, Andrés comes in and says that arrangement between government and the private sector is providing an unfair advantage to the private sector. You're not distributing risks in the right way. You're providing returns to the private sector at a disadvantage from the public sector. So one can actually understand when he said, I want to separate el poder político del poder económico, by an exercise whereby he wanted to renegotiate every single one of these contracts. And a big part of his economic policy was saying, well, I don't like public-partner partnerships and I don't like the reforms because I don't think that risk was evenly distributed. Now that takes us back to the social development debate that we were having. If you look at Peña Nieto administration, there was a very big use, a very big deployment of domestic resources towards each one of those sectors. That went it went to less than a fourth, almost a fifth of those resources were deployed in the last administration. So now again, you can't go back to where we were before because that has been characterized as providing undue privilege, but you cannot stay the same because you don't have enough public money to develop Mexico, and without the private resources, you won't be able to satisfy. So this election, again, at a core, is an election that will probably tell us under what conditions, not going back to where we were, but not staying where we are, will we be able to deploy the resources that we need for the development that the country needs as well.
Excellent. Thank you. We're going to stretch 5 more minutes. We are on time, but I really would like to collect at least 3 quick questions from the audience very briefly, and we will try to wrap up this in the next 5 minutes or so. Please, in the back, if you can introduce yourself, be great.
Hi, my name is José. I am a senior studying political science and global affairs and Latino studies from Mexico, so it's an honor to hear you speak. I'm very interested in comparative migration policy as it regards to international migration, and I've had the honor to study Mexico's 2011 migration policy for my dissertation and my undergraduate thesis. And so my question to you in regards to this law has been in your perspective under the administration, and considering this specific law, which aims to have this shift from like a security-based approach to migration to a more human rights approach to migration, could you discuss how effective this law was in practice, and if there's anything that you would do differently to have changed it or like actually made it better for the people of all Mexico?
We have one here in the front row.
Thank you. Santiago Covarrubias, a lawyer from Panamericana University. I'm a first-year MBA here at Notre Dame. It was great to reflect all these analyses of what has happened in Mexico, and I'm wondering about what can we expect going forward, considering the 2 main paths that seem to be leading the presidential elections, and yeah, like what can we expect going forward?
And finally, Vanessa.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm a Master of Global Affairs student here. Thank you for being here. My question has to do with more so the reaction to COVID that AMLO took in regard to fiscal policy. So after COVID, he said that he did not want to issue public debt, and he was very adamant about not doing so. And just last year, or it was at the beginning of this year, Mexico has become the largest issuer of sovereign bonds. I think it was like 7.5 billion. So I'm just really curious to hear what you think would have been the better approach, because in his combating the pandemic, he really wanted to limit public debt, combat public debt, and then in the end, towards election season, increase public debt significantly. But in the meantime, poverty did fall, unemployment did go up, GDP was stagnant. So I'm curious, what would you have done differently had it not been that?
Thank you.
I would leave it to José Antonio. So I think we have to take advantage of his presence.
So Alejandro has yielded the floor. It's your time.
Thank you, Alejandro. So I'll start from the last one and work my way up. And I think it's interesting. I mean, people chose different mix of policies to address COVID. And at the core of those policies was how much you would limit mobility, because COVID was contracted to mobility. If you reduce mobility by a lot, you reduce the number of contagion and you protected life, but it had a cost to the economy. So you had different policy mixes in terms of how much mobility you tolerated, which basically reflected how much people contagious you had and how much death you had. So there was a trade-off between the economy and health. And in many countries, there was explicitly a compensation whereby you recognize that you were artificially reducing mobility and that therefore you had to compensate both firms and family because they would have less capacity to generate income of their own. I think that if exposed with the benefit of all of that we knew, if the only two choices were supporting economy and families through because of this less mobility with 20% of GDP or zero, probably zero was a better answer. But if you were to choose between 0 and 4%, probably 4% was a much better answer. And I think that if you look at Mexico's GDP growth, Mexico's collapse after COVID was much higher than the world's, and its recovery was much slower because the brunt of COVID was basically paid through by the balance of families and firms. And the public balance was not used to that effect. So again, providing too much support, part of it with the hopes of being pro-cyclical, was probably a bad policy idea. But providing too little actually resulted in less growth and more pain, not just because you were not compensating people enough because of inducing less mobility, but because the repairing their balance sheet after COVID actually cost you more, probably that the support would have cost you. So I think that ex post the policy mix was probably not the right one. And I think that if you look at Mexico's economic performance vis-a-vis the world, I think that from a just pure fiscal policy perspective, Mexico came out of it very well, and our public finances are not strained. But I think that from a growth perspective and just policy and almost legal perspective, the support provided was too little. And I think that our public finances would not have suffered had we deployed anywhere between 2 and 4% of GDP. And that would have done a lot to repair the damage of the balances of families and firms. And that would have resulted, I think, in more growth than the one that we had. Again, now, all of this is with the benefit of hindsight, but I think that the policy mix, just from a macro perspective, without going into valuing whether the non-pharmaceutical interventions and the way that the pandemic was handled in general was the right one or not, just looking at the fiscal response, probably we were wise not to go overboard as many countries did, but we were probably not right in being as stringent as we were, not just from a fiscal perspective, but just on almost from a compensating perspective, because you were imposing undue costs through lack of mobility to people, and you were not compensating the impact that had on their balance sheets. So in terms of the direction of the country, so there's another probably, if you poll and ask people how many of them think that a politician is going to keep his word, literally only 2 of you would think that was the case. Only 4% of people polled think that politicians keep their word. Now, that's a huge mistake. No, politicians do keep their word. They don't achieve the goals, but they do what they said that they wanted to do. So you campaign every day for 6 months. And if you're a disciplined campaigner and you pay attention to your instructions, you will actually campaign by repeating your platform relentlessly for those 6 months. Now, if you win, that platform will be converted into your government's program of work. And you will actually keep tabs that program of work is implemented. Now, again, if the program of work is not the right one, the results will not be the right one, but the programs will be implemented. To what level? On average, around the world, around 70 to 80% of the government's program is implemented. So you have this big disconnect between the 4% that think that they should take the politician at the word and the between 70 and 80% compliance of the program vis-a-vis the platform. What happens with Mexico will be a direct result on how whoever wins, wins. So Claudia is campaigning on the basis of a set of reforms that require a qualified majority. Assuming that she gets a qualified majority, she's going to say what she's going to do, what she said that she's going to do, because she is going to correctly interpret that that's what the people want. And that if she asks for a 2/3 majority to implement an agenda that needs it, and she gets the 2/3 majority, but that's what she's going to do. And if Xochitl were to get a majority, a qualified majority, then she would do exactly what her agenda would have her do. Now, between those two extremes, what will likely happen? It will depend, and that is why I think that elections are key on the level of popular support that each one of the two gets. The closer that you get to an election that's more or less in equilibrium, that's a tight election, the further away that you move from an agenda that requires a big support from Congress, and you likely move to the center. So my impression is that you have these two extremes. You had a president that was very much pro-business, pro-technocratic, and giving all of these autonomous bodies a capacity to act, vis-a-vis a president that was pro-government, anti-technocratic, and that wanted to return the rule of the governance of the country to the government vis-a-vis the autonomies. So those are the two levels, those are the two models that are going to be put forth to the people come the election. Now, if you get something that's tight, Mexico goes back to the center. If the electorate moves to either one of these two extremes, pues either you get closer to pro-business, pro-autonomy, pro-citizen, or you go to pro-government, pro-government's governance rather than the autonomies. So I think that again, that's why elections matter, because they do tell us what people want on the basis of what the candidates put forward. Now, it's interesting because people don't necessarily vote that way, and people end up voting for whoever they like more, and who has the better jingle, and whether or not the jingle is you dance to the rhythm of that jingle at night, or whether he was witty and he was well dressed or not. But the problem with doing that is that you end up voting with a platform that may not be what's more convenient either for you or for the country. But the answer, I think, to your question is where Mexico ends up going is going to be a reflection of which of the two views end up having more popular support. And I think that migration has moving away from the 2011 paradigm. I think that migration is a difficult issue, and probably nowhere more difficult than Mexico, because Mexico has the Mexicans living in the US, the Mexicans that were repatriated from the US to Mexico. You have people that are migrating because they want to get to the US and they use Mexico as a go-to country. You have now the people that are remaining in Mexico as a way to be processed in the context of the US. You have Americans living in Mexico because it makes sense for them economically, or because they were repatriated. To what level? There's more Americans living in Mexico than there are Americans living in Canada, which basically just says that there's a taste for good weather, no? And living in Mexico is much nicer than living in Canada. But because of the deportations, you actually have anywhere between 500,000 to 600,000 American children in Mexico's public schools. So the nuances around that debate makes it difficult to say that it's just a choice between security and human rights, because there's lots of other considerations. In the case of the US, probably the most significant decision in terms of changing that paradigm is we want the Central Americans, we want the other than Mexicans to wait in Mexico for their day in court. That means that today there's probably in Mexico anywhere between 350 to 400,000 people living in Mexico that don't want to stay in Mexico, that are unable to wait for a day in court in the US. That's creating, again, a whole different dynamic in terms of how you find those equilibriums. So I think that we're moving away from this is basically a linear sort of migratory debate where you're trading off, security versus human rights, to something that's become much more complicated in terms of governance, that's more bilateral, that's more nuanced, that's more difficult, and that probably requires us to work more and go back to the drawing board in terms of how that complicated different migratory patterns are better handled.
Wonderful. Jose Antonio, thank you very much. Please join me in
Thank you.
thanking our panel of Alejandro and Jose Antonio. This has been a really provocative panel, and I'm sure there will be more to talk during the breaks and after the end of this day and the reception at 5:45. We will take 5 minutes and move on with the next panel called Judicial Independence and Constitutionalism, led by Jaime Olais and Alfredo Gutierrez and Francisca Pu Jimenez. Thank you very much.
Let me just thank you for allowing me to be the opening act to the main course. So thank you.
No.